Would you ever deny entry to one of the most famous athletes in the world? Shaq stood at the entrance of the high-end nightclub, confused as the bouncer spread his arms, blocking his path. "You're not on the list. Step aside." The crowd fell silent. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones. Shaq chuckled, trying to keep it light. "Come on, man. I could buy this place." The club manager smirked. "Then maybe you should have dressed like it." The bouncer reached for Shaq's arm. That's when the club doors swung open. Someone important had been watching. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The pulsing bass of the club shakes the pavement as Shaq steps out of his SUV, adjusting his hoodie. He's smiling, completely unaware of the insult waiting for him inside. Shaquille O'Neal inhaled the cool night air as he shut his car door behind him. The familiar thump of bass from Aura, the city's most elite nightclub, reverberated through the pavement. The line outside stretched far down the block, filled with high-profile socialites, influencers posing for the perfect Instagram shot, and men in pressed suits laughing over cigars. Shaq had been here before, never needed an invite, never needed a list. He walked toward the entrance, towering over the crowd. Conversations dipped as people recognized him. "That's Shaq," a voice whispered. A few phones shot up, cameras flashing. A group of women in designer dresses whispered among themselves, nudging each other. A couple of guys in suits offered a respectful nod. Shaq smiled, nodding back as he approached the velvet rope. It was another night, another spot. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so he thought. But something shifted. One of the bouncers, a thick-necked man with arms straining against his black polo, tensed as Shaq stepped closer. He turned slightly, murmuring something to the sharply dressed club manager beside him. The manager, a wiry man with slick-back hair and an expensive suit, cut a glance at Shaq. His jaw tightened. He whispered something back to the bouncer, who nodded and took a half-step forward. Shaq noticed. He wasn't new to moments like this. Still, he remained relaxed as he reached the entrance, standing before the rope. The music inside pulsed, the scent of cologne, liquor, and sweat mixing in the air. He glanced at the club manager, expecting the usual greeting, the usual wave inside. Instead, the man stepped forward, blocking his path. His expression wasn't one of excitement or recognition, but something else entirely, a flicker of irritation, maybe even contempt. The crowd behind Shaq hushed. "Hold up," the manager said, crossing his arms. "Where do you think you're going?" Shaq blinked, his easygoing smile faltering for just a second. "Inside," he said simply, his deep voice cutting through the tension. The manager scoffed, his lips curling. He didn't budge. "Yeah," he drawled, looking Shaq up and down, eyes lingering on his hoodie and sneakers. "I don't think so." The bouncer beside him stood firm, muscles tensed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. Some pulled out their phones and sensing something wasn't right. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had seen this before. Different settings, different faces, but the same energy. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Then the manager gestured toward the bouncer. "Step aside, Oris," he said flatly. "You're not on the list." The bouncer unfolded his arms, subtly positioning himself in front of the entrance. Shaq tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You sure about that?" he asked, voice calm. The manager's smirk widened. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." Shaq blinked, amused. Uh, inside?" The manager's lips curled into a smirk, arms still crossed over his chest. He took a slow, exaggerated glance at Shaq's outfit. A black hoodie, crisp jeans, and a pair of fresh white sneakers, and let out a short laugh. "Yeah," he said, shaking his head. "I don't think so." A few people in the line exchanged glances. A couple of them even whispered, eyes darting between the manager and Shaq. Shaq raised an eyebrow. He had dealt with arrogant club managers before, but something about this guy's tone, the smugness, the dismissiveness, rubbed him the wrong way. "You know who I am, right?" Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but firm. The manager let out a dramatic sigh, rubbing his temple like Shaq was exhausting him. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he said, rolling his eyes. "And I don't care." A hush fell over the crowd. Someone audibly gasped. The bouncer beside the manager shifted uncomfortably, but didn't move. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. All right, he said slowly, crossing his arms. So, what's the problem? The manager tilted his head. No problem at all, he said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. You're just not on the list. And let's be honest, he gave Shaq's outfit another pointed look. This isn't really our vibe. Shaq's expression remained unreadable, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He could feel eyes on him, feel the growing tension in the air. From the back of the line, a man in a tailored suit stepped forward, frowning. Yo, you seriously not letting Shaq in? The manager glanced at him, annoyed. And? And that's dumb as hell, the man shot back. A couple of others nodded in agreement. Murmurs spread, but the manager wasn't budging. If anything, the pushback only made him more smug. He turned back to Shaq, offering a fake, almost condescending smile. Look, he said, this is Aura. It's exclusive. We curate who gets in. No hard feelings, but he flicked his wrist toward the sidewalk like Shaq was just some random guy being turned away from a grocery store. Shaq stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled a slow breath. He had two choices: let it slide and walk away, or see how far the manager was willing to take this. He decided to wait it out. The manager turned to the bouncer. Step aside, he ordered. The bouncer, a towering man built like a wall, unfolded his arms and took a half step closer. You're not on the list, the bouncer said, his tone final. Step aside. Shaq tilted his head slightly, that flicker of amusement still in his eyes. You sure about that? He asked again, voice even. The manager's smirk widened. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. The crowd fell silent as the bouncer stepped in front of the entrance. Arms spread wide, his towering figure blocking Shaq's path like a steel gate. A few murmurs rippled through the VIP line. Was this really happening? Were they actually stopping Shaquille O'Neal from getting in? Shaq let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if this was all just a ridiculous misunderstanding. Come on, man, he said, his voice light but firm. I could buy this place. The manager, Eric, leaned in slightly, his smirk widening. Then maybe you should have dressed like it, he shot back, eyes flicking over Shaq's hoodie and jeans. A few people in line exchanged uneasy glances. Someone whispered, did he just say that to Shaq? Shaq exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. So, that's what this is about? He asked. My clothes. Eric shrugged. Like I said, this is Aura. It's exclusive. We have a dress code. The bouncer didn't move. Neither did Shaq. Then someone in the back of the line called out, Yo, that's crazy. Y'all let dudes in here wearing way worse. Eric turned his head sharply, scanning the line. He knew they were watching, recording, waiting for what would happen next. But he didn't back down. Instead, he squared his shoulders, puffed out his chest, and doubled down. Look, Eric said, voice dripping with fake sympathy. Nothing personal, but rules are rules. Now, if you'd kindly step aside. Shaq narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. That's when phones started coming out. Cameras clicked, red recording lights blinked. Eric noticed. His smirk faltered, but only for a second. Then with a casual flick of his wrist, he gestured to the bouncer. Escort him out. The moment Eric said it, gasps erupted from the crowd. The bouncer hesitated. Even he seemed to realize this was going too far. You serious? He muttered, glancing at Eric. Eric's jaw tightened. Yeah, do it. The bouncer let out a breath before reluctantly reaching for Shaq's arm. The second his hand made contact, the club door swung open. The music from inside spilled out onto the street. People turned. Heads snapped toward the entrance. A tall, sharply dressed older man stepped outside, his gaze immediately locking onto the scene. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something powerful. The bouncer instantly let go of Shaq. Eric, however, didn't see the man right away. Go on, he sneered at Shaq. Run along. Maybe next time you'll know your place. Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to, because the second Eric turned around and saw who was standing behind him, his smirk vanished. His face paled. The crowd murmured again. And then, complete silence. The older man took a slow step forward, eyes locked on Eric. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, controlled. What exactly is going on here? Eric swallowed hard. He knew that voice. And suddenly, he knew he was in serious trouble. The air outside the club shifted. The tension, thick and suffocating just moments ago, now felt different. The sharply dressed older man took a slow step forward, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement. His presence alone commanded respect. Every whisper, every camera flash, every smirk from Eric, the club manager, vanished. Eric, still oblivious to what was happening, forced a chuckle. "Mr. Reynolds, don't worry, we're handling it." He gestured toward Shaq. "This guy's trying to get in without following the dress code." The bouncer swallowed hard but didn't move. His grip on Shaq's arm felt less like restraint and more like uncertainty now. Reynolds finally spoke. "Is that so?" His tone was even, controlled, but there was something dangerous in the way he said it. Shaq met the older man's eyes, his own expression unreadable. He'd been in situations like this before. He could recognize power when he saw it. "Is there a problem here?" Reynolds asked, ignoring Eric completely. Eric blinked, confused by the shift in attention. Yeah. Like I said, he's not on the list, and he's not exactly dressed for VIP." The crowd watched in complete silence. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, a slow, disappointed sound. "You know," he said, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, "I've owned this club for 10 years. I've met celebrities, athletes, CEOs, people who could buy this entire street if they wanted." Eric nodded eagerly, clearly missing the point. "Exactly. We have a standard to uphold." Reynolds didn't even look at him. Instead, he turned to the bouncer still holding Shaq's arm. "Let go of him." The bouncer hesitated for only half a second before dropping his hand. Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulder. "Appreciate that," he said smoothly. Eric's confident smirk faltered. "Sir, with all due respect, we have policies. If we start making exceptions, it—" Reynolds held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I make the rules here, not you." Eric's jaw tightened. The crowd shifted, people murmuring again. They could all feel it now. He was losing control. Reynolds finally turned to Shaq, offering a slight nod. "I apologize for my employee's behavior." Eric's face drained of color. Shaq smirked. "So can I go inside now, or do I need a permission slip?" A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Even the bouncer couldn't hide his smirk. Reynolds chuckled lightly before stepping aside and gesturing toward the entrance. "Mr. O'Neal, please, come inside." Eric froze. Shaq walked past him without another glance, stepping into the club like he owned the place. As the doors swung shut behind them, Reynolds turned back to Eric. His voice dropped, cold and sharp. "As for you, we need to have a talk." Eric swallowed hard. He knew that tone, and he knew his night was about to go downhill. Fast. Reynolds took a slow, deliberate step toward the bouncer, his polished dress shoes clicking against the pavement. The sound cut through the heavy silence, making the moment feel even heavier. His gaze was locked on the security guard, voice low but firm. "Did you just put hands on my guest?" The bouncer swallowed hard, stepping back instantly. Eric, the club manager, stiffened beside him, a nervous chuckle escaping. "Guest? He's not—" Reynolds held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Shut up, Eric." The weight of those 3 words hit like a gavel in a courtroom. The crowd outside the club wasn't even pretending not to watch anymore. Shaq adjusted his hoodie, rolling his shoulder where the bouncer had grabbed him. He wasn't mad. He'd been in way worse situations, but the energy in the air had completely shifted now. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly before turning to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, extending a firm hand, "please, come inside." Eric's mouth fell open. The crowd murmured in shock. Someone gasped. A girl in heels nearly dropped her phone. The same bouncer who had blocked Shaq moments ago now held the door open, standing at attention. Shaq grinned, taking Reynolds' hand in a strong shake. "Now that's more like it." He stepped forward, casually strolling past Eric without another glance. The club's neon lights bathed him in a cool glow as he entered, the deep bass vibrating through the floor. The VIP section sparkled. Glass tables, velvet booths, bottles of champagne chilling in ice buckets. The energy was electric. But before Shaq disappeared inside, Reynolds turned back to Eric, his tone dropping to something lethal. "As for you, we need to talk." Eric's confidence shattered instantly. His smirk was gone. replaced with a tight jaw and shifting eyes. "Sir, Reynolds cut him off. "Follow me. Now." The club manager didn't have a choice. The bouncer who had once stood beside him now wouldn't even make eye contact. The other staff members had already started whispering. Eric felt a lump form in his throat. Reynolds led him a few feet away from the entrance, keeping his voice just loud enough for some of the VIP guests to overhear. "You have one job," Reynolds began. "Make sure this club runs smoothly. Make sure paying customers feel welcome. Make sure VIPs get treated like VIPs. Eric nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I—" "Then explain to me," Reynolds interrupted, voice sharp as a knife, "why the hell you just tried to kick out one of the most famous, respected, and wealthiest men in America." Eric's lips parted, but no sound came out. Reynolds didn't wait for an excuse. "Do you have any idea how much this man is worth? How much influence he has? What it means to have Shaquille O'Neal standing in my club instead of taking his business somewhere else?" Eric's breathing quickened. I didn't know it was really him." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And if it wasn't him, it would have been okay to treat someone else that way?" Eric froze. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He judged Shaq, assumed things about him, treated him like an outsider without a second thought. And now he was the one who didn't belong. Reynolds let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You know what? Forget it. You just lost your job, Eric." Eric's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" "You heard me," Reynolds said, turning toward the entrance. "Go home. You're done here." Eric panicked. "Please, I can fix this. I didn't mean to offend anyone." "Doesn't matter," Reynolds said, waving over a different staff member. "We don't do business like that." The final nail in the coffin was when the bouncer, his own guy, stepped up and held the door open again. But this time, it wasn't for Eric. It was for two other security guards who were ready to escort him out. Eric's legs felt heavy. The humiliation burned hot in his chest. As Shaq disappeared inside, the last thing Eric saw was his own reflection in the club's glass doors, his own downfall staring right back at him. Eric's throat went dry as he looked between Shaq and his boss. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sir, I was just—" he stammered, hands shaking slightly. Reynolds wasn't interested in excuses. He folded his arms, his gaze cold and steady. "You just disrespected one of our biggest VIPs." Eric flinched at the word. VIP. Shaq didn't need a reservation, didn't need a list, didn't even need an introduction. He was the list, and Eric had just tried to throw him out like some random nobody. The owner shook his head, his disappointment heavier than anger. "You embarrassed this club," Reynolds said, his voice measured but firm. "Not just tonight. This is going viral. Do you have any idea how much damage you just did?" Eric's face turned pale. He hadn't thought about that. But now he could already feel the ripple effect beginning. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably texts from co-workers or club promoters. Maybe even from his girlfriend. Maybe from someone telling him he was already a meme. The realization hit hard. This wasn't just a bad night. This was career suicide. Eric's eyes darted around the entrance, hoping for someone, anyone, to back him up. The bouncers, stone-faced, the club-goers, recording him, the VIP guests, whispering, shaking their heads. No one was on his side. He was alone. And worse, Shaq didn't even look mad. He just looked amused, like this was just another example of what he'd seen his whole life, like he already knew how this would end. And Eric, he was just another name on the long list of people who had underestimated the wrong man. The final blow, Reynolds turned to the head of security. "Take his name off the payroll, effective immediately." Eric sucked in a sharp breath. "Wait, you're firing me?" "That's exactly what I'm doing," Reynolds said. "You don't represent this club anymore." "But I was enforcing the dress code. I was just trying to—" "You were trying to flex power you didn't have," Reynolds cut in. "And now you're dealing with the consequences." Eric felt his stomach drop. No job, no paycheck, no contacts. And after this night, no chance of working in the industry again. A bouncer stepped forward, holding the door open, but not for Eric. For Shaq. Eric wasn't just fired, he was locked out. Permanently. The doors slammed shut behind him, leaving him standing alone in the cold. Outside, where he belonged. As soon as Shaq stepped through the doors, the energy in the club shifted. The music dipped for a split second, just long enough for heads to turn. Conversations paused mid-sentence. People craned their necks, phones went up in the air, and whispers spread like wildfire. Wasn't he just denied entry? Now he was walking in like he owned the place. The DJ grabbed the mic. "Shaq's in the building!" The bass dropped hard, shaking the walls as the crowd erupted in cheers. People who had just watched him get turned away were suddenly desperate to get close. A group of influencers rushed toward him. "Shaq! Over here!" One guy in an expensive suit held out his hand. "No hard feelings about earlier, huh?" Shaq ignored them. He wasn't here to be petty. He was here to make a point. Bartenders scrambled to pour his favorite drink. A waitress practically sprinted across the floor, setting down a VIP platter before he even ordered. "On the house, Mr. O'Neal," she said breathlessly. Shaq smirked. Now they wanted to treat him right. He took the glass, raised it in a toast, and the crowd went wild. But behind the cheers and celebration, he hadn't forgotten what happened outside. As Shaq made his way through the VIP section, he caught the nervous glances. Some people avoided his gaze altogether, ashamed they had stood by and watched. Others looked guilty, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew the same people now trying to toast to his success had just watched him get humiliated at the door, and none of them had done a damn thing about it. Reynolds, the club owner, motioned toward the best table in the house. "Make yourself comfortable, Shaq." Shaq sat, leaned in, and set his glass down with purpose. Then, without missing a beat, he looked Reynolds in the eye. "So, about your staff." The owner exhaled slowly, shifting in his seat. The weight of Shaq's words hung heavy between them. The entire club was celebrating him now, but that didn't erase what had happened outside. And Shaq, he wasn't going to let it slide. Not yet. Reynolds reached for a bottle of the club's most expensive liquor, pouring it himself. Not the bartender, not a server, the owner. He set the glass in front of Shaq and let out a long sigh. "That shouldn't have happened," he muttered, shaking his head. Shaq studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Yeah," he said, swirling his drink. "It shouldn't have." The bass-heavy music pounded in the background, vibrating through the glassware on the bar. But at this table, it felt like the whole club had gone silent. "I don't care about the club rules," Shaq said, his tone even. "I care about respect." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "And I care about my club's reputation. What Eric did out there, that's not how we treat people here." "Guess he didn't get the memo," Shaq said, taking a slow sip. Reynolds scoffed. "Memo? He's been here for 6 months and thought he owned the door. A little power went to his head, and suddenly he's making decisions that ain't his to make." He shook his head. "He forgot his place, and tonight he just reminded me why some people don't belong in leadership." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do about that?" Reynolds gave a sharp nod to the bar manager across the room. The man immediately picked up his phone and started texting. Shaq glanced toward the bar, where a staff member was quietly removing Eric's name from the club's employee directory. Just like that, the man who thought he controlled the entrance was now locked out for good. Reynolds turned back to Shaq. "Consider that situation handled." Shaq nodded, but he wasn't done. "You sure about that? 'Cause I bet you he's still outside trying to talk his way back in." Reynolds smirked. "Oh, I know he is." He leaned back, tilting his head toward the entrance. "Want to see something funny?" Shaq raised an eyebrow, setting down his glass. Reynolds stood up and motioned for him to follow. The two men made their way toward the VIP balcony, which overlooked the club's entrance below. Shaq wasn't sure what he was expecting to see, but the moment he stepped outside and looked down, he grinned, because standing right there at the entrance, red-faced and sweating, was Eric, desperate, arguing, begging to be let back in. His hands moved wildly as he pleaded with the bouncers. "You don't understand. It was a misunderstanding. I was just following protocol." One of the bouncers shook his head. "Nah, we heard what you said. You knew exactly what you were doing." Eric's face contorted in frustration. Look, man, I was just doing my job." The second bouncer crossed his arms. Not anymore, you're not. Phones were out. Recording. Eric knew it. His worst moment was now being documented for the whole world to see. Shaq chuckled and shook his head. Man, this just keeps getting better. Eric's voice wavered as he stood outside, his fists clenched at his sides. This is a mistake, he stammered, trying to keep his composure while the crowd watched. But the bouncers weren't budging. Come on, guys! Eric's voice pitched higher, laced with desperation. I was just doing my job! A few chuckles rippled through the onlookers. The taller bouncer shook his head. Not anymore, you're not. Eric's face drained of color. The dozen or so people still standing outside were eating this up. Some whispered to each other. Others held up their phones, cameras aimed right at him. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a moment that would follow him forever. Wait, hold on, Eric said, raising a hand like he could somehow pause the moment. You can't just... The second bouncer took a slow step forward, arms crossed over his chest. Oh, we can, he said, his voice calm but firm. And we did. Eric's jaw clenched. He turned his head, searching the VIP balcony, and there they were. Shaq and Reynolds watching from above. Shaq had a drink in his hand, his expression unreadable. Reynolds? A slight smirk. They weren't coming to save him. They were watching him drown. Eric swallowed hard. Look, I get it. You're mad, but I... Mad? The bouncer laughed. Bro, this ain't about us. It's about you. You made your choice. Eric's hands twitched at his sides. I just did what the club expects. VIPs have a dress code. Rules. The taller bouncer raised an eyebrow. VIPs. Like Shaquille O'Neal? A few people laughed. Eric felt it then. The crushing weight of reality. The realization that no one was on his side. Okay. Eric gritted his teeth, lowering his voice. Look, maybe I made a mistake, but I've been here 6 months. You're really just going to throw me out over one thing? The bouncer sighed, shaking his head. Man, he said, you didn't just make one mistake. You made the biggest mistake. Eric's brows furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? The bouncer took one slow step back. Then with a deep finality, he reached for the doors and slammed them shut. The locks clicked. Eric was out. Permanently. The crowd gasped. Someone whistled. A girl in heels passed by and muttered, Yikes! Eric's stomach twisted. Phones were still recording. And just like that, his career was over. A news anchor smirked as the headline flashed across the screen. VIP club kicks out Shaq and regrets it instantly. Behind her, footage rolled. Shaq being stopped at the door, the manager sneering, the bouncer grabbing his arm. And then, the club owner stepping in, the bouncer stiffening in terror, the swift downfall of Eric. Social media was already on fire. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the video had already been shared millions of times. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Everywhere Shaq looked, his name was trending. Shaq of the club. Shaq, Eric, you fumbled. Shot hit on Shaq's club. Now, one tweet with over 500,000 likes read, Imagine being so bad at your job that you kicked Shaq out of a club. Another tweet had a before and after meme. Left side, Eric blocking Shaq at the door. Right side, Shaq inside, surrounded by VIPs holding a drink. Caption, Karma works fast, Shaq works faster. On TikTok, a remix of the argument, paired with a viral dance beat, was blowing up. Over 1.2 million people had used the sound. But the biggest damage? The club's official Instagram was flooded with angry comments. By noon, the club had no choice but to release a public statement. We deeply regret last night's events. Our establishment stands for respect and inclusivity. Effective immediately, the manager involved is no longer employed with us. The comment section? Brutal. Too late. Shaq owns this place now. Should have fired him before he embarrassed you. Very incompetent people. Y'all management team. Even celebrity accounts joined in. NBA players, rappers, actors, they were all watching. Some announced boycotts of the club. Others made jokes. Shaq's club opening when? And just when things couldn't get crazier, Shaq's phone buzzed. A message from Reynolds, the club's owner. Reynolds, you free for a call? Shaq smirked, texting back. Shaq, depends. You about to make me an offer? Reynolds sent a laughing emoji, then another text. Reynolds, you know what? Reynolds, yeah, want to own part of the club? Shaq grinned. This night just got a whole lot better. Shaq leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs as his phone screen glowed in the dim light. The message from Reynolds sat there waiting for a response. Want to own part of the club? Shaq exhaled slowly, a grin creeping across his face. Let's make some changes, he finally typed back. And just like that, the club that had once rejected him was about to become his. A week later, headlines splashed across social media. Shaq becomes co-owner of exclusive VIP club. Twitter exploded. Remember when they kicked him out? LMNAO. Now they gotta answer to him. Karma is undefeated. Shaq took revenge and turned it into a business deal. That's next level. The first change Shaq made? New bouncer uniforms. When the club reopened that weekend, every security guard stood at the door wearing fresh black jackets. On the back of each jacket, Shaq's logo. Right above the words, "Respect is VIP." The club had officially become his territory. The VIP line stretched even longer than before. People weren't just coming to party anymore. They were coming to see Shaq's revenge in action. Inside, the energy was electric. The DJ hyped up the crowd. We in Shaq's house tonight. Bartenders mixed custom drinks named after him. The menu had changed too. One drink stood out, the Shaq Shake-Up, in honor of the club's new management. People ate it up. Even the staff seemed relieved. With Eric gone, the tension from before had disappeared. Shaq watched from the VIP lounge, nodding in satisfaction. But then, a man in an expensive suit stepped forward at the entrance. The same bouncer who once denied Shaq now stood there, arms crossed. The man gave a smug smile and asked, "Hey, Shaq, can I get in?" Shaq leaned forward, recognizing the face immediately. Eric, dressed sharp, like he was trying to reclaim his status. A few people nearby whispered, noticing him. Shaq glanced at his new head of security. The bouncer raised an eyebrow, waiting for Shaq's call. Shaq smirked. "Depends," he said, tapping his chin. "You on the list?" Shaq smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Depends. You on the list?" The once confident Eric faltered, shifting uncomfortably in his expensive suit. He forced a laugh, trying to play it cool. "Come on, Shaq. That was just business, you know that." The line outside grew silent, all eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Some people whispered, some recorded. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. And then he simply said, "Nah." The bouncer at the door didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and blocked Eric's path. "Sorry, man. No entry tonight." Eric's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious." The people waiting in line were loving every second of this. A few chuckles echoed through the crowd. Someone even muttered, "Damn, that's karma hitting hard." Eric, now desperate, turned back to Shaq. "Look, man, I get it. I messed up. But I was just doing my job. I had rules to follow." Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then he asked, "And whose rules were those?" Eric hesitated. "The club's." Shaq nodded. "And who owns the club now?" Eric's jaw tightened. "You." Shaq shrugged. "Exactly. And I got new rules." Eric's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You're really doing this? After everything?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Everything? Bro, you tried to kick me out of my own club." Eric opened his mouth to argue, then shut it, because he had no defense. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Shaq wasn't kicking him out to be petty. He was showing him exactly how it felt to be judged unfairly, to be dismissed, to be denied entry. Not for who he was, but for how someone else saw him. And Eric finally got it. For the first time that night, his shoulders slumped. "I get it," he muttered. "I really do." Shaq sighed, then gestured toward the bouncer. "Let him in." The bouncer blinked. "You sure?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, but not as a VIP." Eric didn't understand at first, until Shaq's next words hit him like a ton of bricks. "You want back in? You start at the bottom?" Eric frowned. "Start at the bottom? What's that supposed to mean?" Shaq leaned forward. "You want a second chance? Earn it." He pointed toward the bar. "They need more staff. You can start as a barback. Clean up drinks, stock the shelves, Learn how to actually treat people right. Eric's face burned red. A barback? Man, I was the manager. Shaq shrugged. Yeah? And look where that got you. Eric clenched his jaw, looking around. The crowd was still watching. If he refused now, he'd leave as the ex-manager who got publicly rejected from the club he used to run. But if he took the job, it would be the hardest pill to swallow. A long silence stretched between them. Then Eric swallowed his pride. Fine, he muttered. I'll do it. Shaq nodded. Good choice. Over the next few weeks, the club's reputation skyrocketed. People were coming not just for the music and atmosphere, but because they knew the place had changed. It wasn't just for the rich and famous anymore. Now everyone was welcome. And Eric? He showed up for every shift. He worked harder than anyone. People who once feared him as a stuck-up manager now respected him as a hustler. And slowly but surely, he earned that respect back. One night after closing, Shaq found Eric wiping down the bar. So? Shaq said. You still mad at me? Eric let out a short laugh. Honestly? I needed this. Shaq smirked. Yeah, I know. And then? Shaq slid a fresh staff badge across the counter. On it, in bold letters, Eric, floor manager. Eric stared at it, then looked up in disbelief. Wait, seriously? Shaq shrugged. You earned it. That night, Shaq made one last post online. It was a picture of him and Eric standing side by side in the club. The caption? Big guys belong everywhere, but respect? That belongs to everyone. The internet ate it up. This is what leadership looks like. Shaq turned an enemy into an ally. That's next level. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect, that can be expensive. The club's business boomed. Eric's career took a turn he never expected. And Shaq? He enjoyed every second of it, sitting back in his VIP booth, watching the crowd thrive. He took a sip of his signature drink, the Shaq Shake-Up, and with that, he finally got the peaceful night he'd come for. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect, that can be expensive.